Hi everyone. Okay, thanks for that really useful introduction. Actually, saves me explaining a lot of stuff. And just to say, first of all, it's a real privilege to be one of the speakers here today. Such a diversity of talks. It's kind of really diverse practices. Feeling a little bit like probably the most like a practitioner in a traditional sense out of everyone who's spoken today, which is really odd for me because I don't often feel like that at all. Hence the name, the title I gave to my talk today, Doing Things the Wrong Way Around, which in retrospect I think could almost apply to pretty much everyone here today. But it is something I find myself saying a lot about myself, my own kind of career trajectory, the way I kind of practice architecture, the way I kind of approach architecture, and maybe the projects that I've done to date. So just for clarity, I am not an architect in the traditional sense of the word. How I describe myself at the moment in my bio, and for anyone who kind of asks me in a professional sense, is a multidisciplinary designer who works primarily in the fields of art, architecture, product and exhibition design, which is a kind of long-winded way of kind of saying I'm not an architect, because basically I don't have the qualification, I don't have professional accreditation, I haven't kind of gone that far. It's interesting that I run a practice now called Ordinary Architecture, and finding very little of what we do is kind of architecture in the traditional sense. So that's our Ordinary Architecture logo. So just to kind of give you an insight perhaps of what we do and what we're up to, this is the most recent project that we've worked on. As Mona said, we've only been doing it just short of 3 years now, and in a way it's kind of one of the kind of most high-profile projects we've done to date. And it's an exhibition, it's not a piece of architecture. But it's an exhibition about architecture, and it contains a series of works that are about architecture in one of the most kind of notable institutions of art in London, the Royal Academy, which is actually one of the few kind of independent art institutions in London that has an art school and a kind of really quite open attitude, an independent attitude and approach to kind of art and architecture. It's run by artists. This is Michael Craig Martin's treatment of the Royal Academy for the summer exhibition this year. And there's a certain sort of freedom and liberation, I think, in the way that they commission people to do work for them. So we were commissioned at the beginning of the year to produce a series of interventions that offer a contemporary counterpoint to the origin myths of architecture. We've proposed, we've now built a series of works that are kind of dotted around the building in spaces that are either normally occupied by permanent works that have been removed temporarily for some renovation work that's going on at the moment. These two large canvases, those ceiling blanks that you just saw, these two huge canvases either side of the main stair, this kind of empty stairwell, a sculpture shelf up in the top level Sacra Gallery, and this tiny room, which is the architecture room, which is the smallest room in the whole building, which is where the architecture exhibitions get to play with, and then this kind of small dark room, which is part of the library collection. So we're invited to come up with a series of interventions exploring, as I say, the origin myths of architecture, but in kind of a very kind of taking the origin myths of architecture as a kind of counterpoint to propose kind of alternative mythologies, I guess, to explore some of our own approaches and perhaps a kind of alternative, kind of contemporary approach to architecture today, certainly how we see it. So it's very much not a lesson in architecture. It's a chance to kind of explore other ideas about architecture. So to put that into a bit of context, taking probably the oldest and most archaic kind of theory about architecture, the primitive shed, Logier's theory of the primitive shed, the primitive hut, sorry, the primitive hut, being trees clashed together to create shelter, and that being the kind of origin of classical architecture, the form that it made. And then our translation, which is a kind of ordinary, everyday, contemporary translation of the kind of primitive hut into the idea of an example of what might be described as that today, which is the garden shed, and taking ideas about decoration and kind of motifs like the duck and dart, the egg and the dart, into again a kind of more contemporary translation. So those are some of our starting points for the exhibition. We divided it into 5 spaces, kind of looking at different ideas about architecture. The first one being construction, so the primitive shed being a kind of starting point. This was these are the paintings that are installed in the ceiling roundel at the moment that have been removed. In the centre, it's the Graces unveiling nature, surrounded by the natural elements, so fire, air, earth, and water, kind of circling around in this kind of heavenly, celestial scene. And we've replaced those with our own kind of version, a kind of contemporary allegory of architecture rather than art. So we're kind of looking upwards, heavenly, to this kind of frame, this empty frame of the primitive shed, the primitive hut, and in a kind of trompe l'oeil kind of effect that you see employed normally in ceiling paintings like this. And around it, there's a view of it unexploded, which might make slightly more sense. So all the components of a kind of basic frame, basic kind of garden shed, viewed from a worm's eye perspective. So the do-it-yourself shed, circled by 4 elements kind of construction as we see it. So air is represented by ventilation bricks, earth is represented by concrete foundation pads, fire by these terracotta chimneys, and water by this kind of network of pipes. And there are 4 other paintings at either end that represent the 4 elements of art that have been removed as well. So colour, composition, design and invention, which we replaced with the kind of Vitruvian values of which I'm sure we all know from architecture school, of firmitas, which is represented by a kind of structural diagram about shear force and horizontal loading. Utilitas, which is a kind of program of kind of space use and organisation, kind of hat showing different uses for different compartments. Veritas, which represents delight, which is this kind of image of the golden section, but kind of distorted into an ovoid. And we made up the last one, Sustain-us, because we kind of thought we needed 4, and we probably thought that's probably the value that a lot of people hold dear today, so represented by the endless cycle of arrows. So there's the work installed, which we think looks rather fantastic in these kind of gold-rimmed frames in this highly decorative ceiling. And there's the central roundel. So next we took space as a theme, and looking at kind of classical and modern ideas of space. These are the 2 wall canvases that have been removed by Sebastian Ricci, which kind of explore space in a more classical way, but very kind of narrative and fantastical, and dealing with issues of kind of depth and classical space. So they are huge. They're 5 metres by 3 metres tall, either side of the main stair. And we've replaced them with our own kind of version of a kind of modernist space, decorated with kind of classical columns, but in this kind of endless, almost like digital modernist grid, accompanied by a real 3D object of the column that's depicted in the image, but it's kind of cut off at a slightly odd angle to kind of represent a sort of 2D axonometric version from the drawing. So where the drawing is cut off, the kind of object takes over. So on one side it's the classical column, and on the other side it's the kind of modernist column, steel I-beam. So that's the not quite at scale, but almost. And it's quite it's meant to be slightly disorientating as you're coming up the staircase and kind of moving into this space. It's not quite clear whether you're kind of looking up or down. It's a fairly kind of dynamic space in itself. So kind of moving through these huge graphics is quite disorientating. So these are the 2 columns, and this is the 2 columns being produced. This is kind of halfway through the production method, which I wanted to show you because there's a point to make about the budget that we had and kind of how much money we had to spend and kind of a huge amount of creativity just in kind of producing a number of objects for a very, very small budget. So it's basically hot wired from foam, all of the objects that we made, and then skimmed in a layer of plaster to kind of give this kind of like plaster effect. So those are the 2 columns in situ. And those are the 2 canvases in space. So the third space was about shelter, and we were really interested in the kind of ideas about shelter being about kind of fabrics and animal skins and about wall hangings rather than kind of solid walls, like these kind of much looser kind of fabrics being the origins of kind of cladding and walls. So we kind of explored a contemporary idea about animal skins and invented a kind of narrative about urban animal skins and where kind of cladding patterns and modern kind of construction patterns might have come from. I guess the architects in the audience will be familiar with the kind of 2D CAD hatch pattern of brickwork, taking its kind of palette from an animal graphic, the leopard graphic, as being a shingle pattern using the kind of giraffe print. The pantile roof represented in kind of tiger colours, and crazy paving kind of zebra effect. And we invented this wallpaper telling this kind of story of these mythical urban animals who are kind of hunted down, chased out of cities by architects trying to make buildings out of their skins. And those skins were stitched together to kind of form a kind of wall piece and then hung from the staircase. They were printed onto leather, which gave them this really kind of lovely kind of floppy kind of folding kind of character, which again kind of challenges ideas about solid kind of walls and solid construction. There's a couple more in situ. The fourth space was exploring decoration, which is something we're really kind of big fans of, really interested in. We took our lead from a book by John Summerson about the classical language of architecture and exploring the origins of cornices and kind of profiles of kind of classical moulds. And we invented our own one, which is a clear rip-off of the cover of the book. But with a completely different origin. That profile is actually based on the coastline of a county in the UK called Essex. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it's where the house came from. It's actually where I'm from, and my co-director Charles is from as well. So it seemed kind of appropriate as kind of like a personal, invented myth made physical and turned into a cornice. So that was one of the first images we actually drew, and then the idea was to create a kind of series of these coastline cornices, maybe map the whole of the British Isles in a series of cornices. The three that we settled on were Essex, Cornwall and Kent, and again this kind of hot wire, high density foam extrusion method. Kind of love these views of the kind of like halfway through production. And those were the final pieces, extruded. And what's really nice about this piece is these cornices actually sit on a giant cornice of the old, if you can see below, this is like the top layer of the actual exterior of the old Burlington house that's been incorporated into the new galleries, forming a kind of sculpture shelf. So something quite nice about the cornices sitting on another kind of giant cornice. And the final theme we looked at was precedent, which is basically involved raiding the archives of the Royal Academy, which was a real treat, and exploring through lots of old books and treaties and drawings and kind of pulling out references to support our kind of show and our ideas, which we arranged in this room. But there was a centrepiece for this room, which we made especially, this kind of fantastic object, which is exploring, again, ideas about the kind of classical orders. And we call this the greengrocer's order, kind of invented our own order. I don't know if greengrocers has the same translation here, but it's a kind of a shop that sells fruit and vegetables on the high street that you can find everywhere. So we made that. We made that by hand. We bought a whole pile of artificial fruit from eBay, and we rolled our sleeves up and got the glue out and assembled it. Kind of not really knowing quite what we're doing, but the architecture, form, space and order book at hand to help us along the way. So these fantastic kind of fruit, fake fruits, and all kinds of, I mean, every method you can think of sticking these things together and holding them together. So that's the first move. Pineapples, got very messy at times. Barbecue sticks, double-sided tape, Velcro, hot glue, kind of everything you can think of to get these vegetables in shape. And that was the final capital before we decided to turn it to stone, which looks kind of fantastic. There was a moment where we were like, oh, should we just keep it as colour because it looks so good? But we decided that the full act of turning this into stone was kind of the architectural act in a way. So set about several coats of white paint later. It's kind of that kind of process of petrification, almost turning it to stone through the spraying process until it kind of reached this kind of pure stone whiteness. And then we had a final room that was basically revisiting each of those themes and proposing a kind of origin to a kind of final proposition. So that's all the components of the shed kind of laid out and then assembled as a final shed. That's the two columns assembled to kind of create this hall of endless columns, mirrored columns. The animal skins just fresh from the hunt, hanging out to dry, and then assembled into this kind of leather warehouse, perhaps, that's been kind of, the prints become a kind of 2D application on the facade and nothing more. The cornices being used in a house for Essex and a house for Kent, which face each other across the River Thames, in kind of opposition or perhaps a kind of gesture of friendliness. And then the final application of the greengrocer's column becoming a column for an actual greengrocer's shop itself. So as I said, it's kind of not, it kind of is architecture, but it's kind of not architecture in a traditional sense. With a good dose of kind of ordinariness, which is, obviously the name of our practice, and something we're fascinated by, and we explore, and we attempt to sort of integrate in all the work that we do. We actually write a monthly column for the RIBA journal that's called Ordinary Architecture, and it's about ordinary architectural typologies. And this is where the idea for the Greengrocers column first came. It was our first column. We wrote about the ordinary architecture of the greengrocer's shop, and how living fruit and vegetables become kind of living Corinthian capitals. We wrote about the ordinary architecture of the caravan, the pleasure pier, and how they lead to nowhere, the minicab office, kind of like a art installation in itself. But ultimately, ordinary architecture, I think, is something it's very difficult to create as designers and as architects, and it seems to constantly exist purely as reference rather than kind of proposition. What we actually end up doing and kind of probably strive to do is something that's more extraordinary. As Mona explains, there's a kind of legacy to our practice that comes from a very extraordinary practice called fat architecture, where I worked for about 5 years, the last 5 years of their practice, and my co-director Charles was a director there for 20 odd years. That's how we met, that's how we got together. So just a sprinkling of the kind of work that FAT did, if you're not familiar, and you can see it's kind of pretty extraordinary stuff, and not very traditional. Culminated in this final project, as Mona said. This is the House for Essex, which is county where I grew up. It's kind of part countryside, part industrial area, a real mix, much maligned by the rest of the country, so it felt quite special to be able to create a really special piece of architecture there. It was a collaboration with this guy, Grayson Perry, who is a Turner Prize winning artist who I'm sure a few of you are familiar with. So it's a collaborative project. He's an artist, and he works in ceramics predominantly, as well as other things. So it's a real collaboration, a real kind of richness of narrative and material and decoration, and these kind of bespoke tiles, which are all telling the story of Julie, this woman of Essex, and all the kind of trinkets and memorabilia of her life are kind of encrusted in the exteriors as this kind of shrine to Julie, and then the interiors is kind of like wonderfully kind of theatrical space, double height space that's actually incredibly livable at the same time, but an explosion of kind of colour and decoration and flamboyant narrative. And that project actually led to an invitation for a competition. So the House for Essex was a project that we kind of adopted as our first project to deliver ordinary architecture, and we were thinking it's going to lead to all kinds of fantastic commissions. And this is one of the first kind of interesting invitations we got. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London, so another really notable institution of art, applied arts, having a big revamp at the moment, and they were looking for architects to redesign their members' room, their new members' room, and they invited us to submit some ideas for that. So kind of exploring these ideas about kind of radical decoration, but dipping into the kind of V&A's collection of these kind of really rich decorative arts, and kind of looking at ideas of decoration, but kind of thinking about kind of contemporary sense of craft and craft and decoration. So we were looking at we got particularly fascinated with marquetry. and we came up with a palette of kind of contemporary marquetry using kind of contemporary graphics, but obviously made in a kind of traditional way, and made our proposals for the members' room basically based around these ideas. So a really kind of rich palette of kind of luxurious materials, highly decorative, highly colourful. We came second. We didn't win. Apparently we were very close, but they decided it would be too risky to upset their members if they went and did something like this. So they went for a much safer option in the end, which is kind of fair enough. Disappointing. But what happened is it led to a really great commission that we did earlier this year, which is an exhibition called The World of Fragile Parts, which was the V&A's first appearance at the Venice Biennale. They're now kind of permanent partner of the Architecture Biennale, and they have a permanent pavilion there now called the Pavilion of Applied Arts. This was the first year. This was the first time they have a pavilion, so we were the first exhibition designers to work with them. So it's a bit of an experiment for them, and a bit of an experiment for us. We worked really closely with a curator team, and we had about 3 or 4 months from start to finish to kind of come up with not just the curatorial theme, but the design and the build in time to open. So it's pretty hectic. This is the space, just one of the many kind of fantastic rooms, this continual program of restoration at Venice in the Biennale buildings. This is the point in the Arsenale where it kind of turns the corner, and there's some rooms outside. So it's the first time this room had been seen, been used. And the idea was to take some of the collection from London, from the cast courts, which are these two, if you haven't been there, two just fantastic rooms that are all about this kind of period, intense period of copying in the Victorian times, when us Brits went around travelling around the world and fiercely copying as much as we could and bringing it back to London. And there's all these fantastic plaster copies of some really incredible pieces of architecture, and some of them are actually the only record of certain pieces of buildings, certain works. So it's a really precious collection now. And the idea was to take the idea of copying and kind of explore that in a 21st century way in Venice. So our ideas for about Venice is kind of a museum in a way. The city is kind of a museum itself, and V&A is possibly the opposite of that. It's kind of a museum that contains bits of city in it. So we came up with a kind of design language that was about a kind of fragile world of kind of fragmented pieces of architecture, fragmented pieces of city, broken architecture, if you will, with this kind of really rich kind of palette, which is from the V&A cast rooms itself. We came up with a series of display furniture, which is kind of meant to look like kind of broken bits of building, broken pieces of architecture that would become display and plinths, and display the objects from the collection inside them. So this is kind of the final plinth idea that we came up with. We came up with this kind of broken vitrine table for displaying objects inside and on top of, and these kind of broken walls for displaying some of the imagery. So this was the layout for the room, which is a kind of a walk through history, starting with the kind of 19th century cast courts and ending up with an idea about 21st century copying. So yeah, 3D visual. And then this is the exhibition itself, how it was realised. So the arch, those pieces were taken from the cast room itself, and is a kind of a ghost of the arch that they came from, and the missing parts are the ones that they haven't got copies of. So it's a kind of ghost of an original arch. And then these are the display plinths tables filled with all these fantastic objects. Okay, so yeah, again, kind of not architecture in a traditional sense. In a way, it kind of felt like the most architectural project I'd done in terms of the series of drawings and the amount of kind of information that we had to give to the production team in Venice. But it was quite interesting once we handed over the drawings. Very little of it was kind of built to those detailed drawings, and it kind of went to a local artisan team who basically made all of those bits of furniture themselves. And most of our drawings were kind of useless in the end, which was interesting. So it's kind of, I guess it's exhibition design, it's not architecture, it's a little bit like architecture. But as I said, I don't really think of myself as an architect. Not least because I actually only graduated my master's 2 years ago. So in a way it's kind of a really rapid trajectory for me to be 2 years out of art college and running my own practice and building exhibition designs and at the V&A and at the Royal Academy. But it's kind of a really slow trajectory as well, because I'm a mature student. I'm in my mid-40s now. I started my studies in my mid-30s. After a really rich and varied career that involved pulling pints and working in print shops for a number of years before studying. And then my student work, this is one of my first student projects. As you can see, my real background was kind of in graphic design. Lots of my work and the kind of work, the drawings I've been showing you from Ordinary kind of probably explain that in a way. So it's a handful of kind of student work, which ultimately led to this project, which I was actually working on in my final year of studies, which was kind of the first year of Ordinary architecture, and it was a result of a mid-study trip out to Los Angeles, where I met some really interesting people, young architects doing projects on their own, self-motivated, self-funded, just kind of desperate to build, to design, to get some work out there. So I kind of felt a natural affinity with them, and they invited me back a year later to take part in a project that they'd organised. Again, no fee, very few funds, but a very glamorous location in the Hollywood Hills. What a lot of people don't know about Hollywood is it was actually a piece of real estate. It started life as a piece of real estate, and that big sign went up to try and attract people to buy houses, because that was a kind of a new thing. And once the houses had been filled, the sign kind of fell apart and degraded. It was built of really kind of terrible materials. And then these guys, or a group of guys like them, kind of came together to raise funds to re-erect the Hollywood sign, because it had become this kind of icon of LA, and it's now a kind of piece of heritage, protected piece of heritage. So for me, working with something like the Hollywood sign, a kind of 2D graphic writ large in this kind of fantastic landscape was a real had real appeal. So the sign, it's kind of it's in every disaster movie. It kind of represents the end of the world in every disaster movie you can think of. It's reappropriated for advertising. It's even reappropriated in a town near me called Basildon, who are trying to kind of glam up their image. So they put it in the middle of a roundabout, not quite the same context. But the back of the sign is almost as iconic as the front. This is an Ed Ruscha painting, and he painted the Hollywood sign quite a lot. And his view of it from behind is just kind of looking at things differently, looking at things from reverse. It's a scene for celebrities to have their photo taken against, but it's also a scene where everyone can go and kind of feel a little bit of Hollywood, and the internet is full of these images of people taking selfies in front of Hollywood. So it's a really popular image. It's a really accessible image, which again is really kind of appealing for me to work with. So the first site visit, it's probably the most glamorous site visit I've ever done. So climbing the Hollywood Hill to get to the sign, one of the first things you notice is how fragile the landscape is actually, and there's all these warnings of kind of falling rocks and crumbling mountainside. And then once you get to the top, it's kind of like that Ed Ruscha image. You never really get up close to the sign. It's always in the distance, and then as soon as you get to the top, suddenly you're behind it, and the view, of course, is fantastic. But the sign is just always out of reach. So that kind of inspires an idea about trying to recreate the sign, but at human scale, in a way that people can kind of interact with it, and to stop it being this kind of frustrating thing that's out of reach. So we took the letters and we developed a series of viewfinders dotted up the trail. It's about a 3¼ kilometre trail. It's quite grueling in the sun. We made these viewfinders out of really simple materials. These are just some pieces of wood with tape wrapped around them, and I've still no idea what that is at the top, but it's a piece of plumbing equipment that I got from the local hardware store. And we sprayed them to kind of match the rockfall signs. This is me making a giant Y in a workshop. So again, really basic materials: hot glue gun, polyboard. Making these kind of life-size letters, and then piling them in the back of a truck to take up the hill, so they wouldn't all fit. So we had our friends help us take them up. And you can only drive so far, and then you have to get off and go by foot, which actually kind of beautifully ended up in some of the best images of the whole project, of people just carrying these giant letters up the hill. This is one of my favourites. This kind of massive L with this cityscape in the background. And the idea was that these letters would just be kind of found in the landscape, on the trail, just kind of like they tumbled down the hillside, and each one was accompanied by a viewfinder. So the passerby would kind of come across his letters and maybe wonder how they got there. They would see the viewfinder. First of all, they're able to kind of get up close with the letter and touch it, hold it, hug it, pose with it. And this was the idea, and it was really great to see that that's what actually happened. We've got some great Facebook pictures and Instagram pictures, everyone having their photos taken with the letters. So that bit worked really well. And then the viewfinder was kind of it was a fake viewfinder that we basically took a photo through the kind of non-existent lens of the scene, and repasted it on the back of the viewfinder of this image looking up to the sign, but with each letter missing kind of progressively as you moved up the hill. So you'd find a letter, you'd move up the hill a little bit further, until it's just a Y, and there's nothing left. So after the event, what was really nice again is that the project had a kind of had a longer life to it. The letters were brought down from the hill, and they became furniture for a party for kind of the after event, which worked really well. And eventually they were turned into permanent kind of relics. So we found a local cement supplier to kindly accidentally drop a load of cement into the letters, and turning them into these kind of these kind of petrified ruins of themselves, which now sit in a public car park that anyone can kind of share. So that project was was a real eye-opener, and it's kind of led to similar projects with people in LA. Again, always on a kind of tight budget, but always super fun and super kind of like handmade and DIY. This was a mini golf course in an area of community area of LA, a kind of meanwhile use for a site that's going to be built on, but a way of kind of bringing the local community together. 9 designers were invited to design 9 golf holes. I did this kind of traditional windmill, which is kind of the spinning windmill that you have to get the ball through the small door at the end, missing the blades. But it was a kind of play on the LA landscapes. The blades are kind of like the blades of a palm tree. The materials that we use for the tower are kind of very much an LA aesthetic. This kind of like DIY, deconstructed sort of Pomo aesthetic, and then the whole thing resembling a kind of wind turbine, which is a kind of comment about the sustainability, the status of kind of renewable technologies, and LA's trying very hard to address these issues right now. So that was the finished project. The opening party. So yeah, the future of architecture. For me, I guess you've seen all the way through. There's pictures of me kind of making down on the floor, sticking things together with glue and carving things out in a studio. And I guess for me, it's quite interesting to be working with some really high-profile clients, but not being able to make a living from those projects at all. So it's an opportunity to do some fantastic work, but I totally have to supplement what I do with teaching and writing and other kind of more mundane activities. So, which is kind of fine for me, but I guess it's kind of representative of possibly a lot of us in the room, and possibly the future of architecture, and the need to kind of pursue alternative practices. So for me, yeah, my future possibly looks a little bit like that, which is fine, so long as, if I could do it somewhere like that, then I think I wouldn't mind too much. That's the end for me.
Thank you, Elly. Are there any questions? There's one.
Might be a difficult question to answer at the moment. But for example, if you were to describe your work in a sentence or a quote, that would be, let's say, the rule of the core rule of your work, what would that be?
I guess I go back to the title slide, and I'd say it's doing things the wrong way around. Like I say, it's a phrase I find myself using whenever I try and explain my professional trajectory and any of the work that I do, and it's never intentional, but it kind of always seems to end up that way, I guess. It feels peculiar to be someone in their mid-40s who's right at the beginning of their career, yet working with very established people for notable institutions. It kind of all feels upside down and wrong, coupled with the fact that I find it very hard to draw a salary every month from any of this work. So yeah, it all feels like the wrong way around, and I'm probably as confused as most of you about the future of practice in that way. That's a too long a sentence.